Okay, good afternoon, Dad. Today is Friday, December 6th. And did you watch the Tucker's interview with Sergey Lavrov yet?
I I managed to watch the first maybe 15 minutes of it. Actually, not long before, not long ago. I ran out of time, so I got
Okay.
15 minutes into it.
Okay, well, we won't talk about it then, but I thought it was a great interview and I hope
Hmm.
it has some impact. It's great to see Tucker
Yeah,
speaking to the other side. I feel
right.
like he's done more diplomacy than the rest of the State Department combined. Well, I mean, the State
Yeah,
Department is doing anti-diplomacy, so.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. No, no. More power to him. I mean, really, it's wonderful what he's doing. I've just struck. I'll just say in the 15 minutes. I knew this already, of course, but just by the intelligence and the erudition of this man, and in general of the Russian leadership. I think you probably can say the same thing for the Chinese and the Iranian leadership. I mean, these are countries that are run by cultured, intelligent people, and that's not what we have. Just look at our most recent presidents and presidential candidates. That's not the kind of people that lead in the West, and it's hard to explain. But that's I think it's a glaringly obvious fact for anybody who really looks at the situation honestly.
Right. How would you describe U.S. leadership?
Well, it's just, I mean, varying degrees of, moronic and vicious, and it's just, yeah, the whole discourse has been just dumbed down, and the kind of people that that we have pushed forward that our so-called leaders are just seem to have be incapable of holding complex thoughts in their head, or it's just I could go on and on. It's just like there's just in every respect. I mean, the leadership is dismal, and it's just astonishingly dismal. I don't think I really could. I could spend the whole day talking about it, but I'm not going to.
Are there any bright spots that you see within the U.S. government?
Within the U.S. government, in any leadership position, well, there's some bright spots in the incoming administration. I'll have to say. I mean, that he has selected some people, like I mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, but then also the person that is supposed to run. What is it? It's an Indian.
Kash
Who?
Patel
Yeah.
or whatever?
Is he in charge of the FBI? I
FBI.
think.
FBI,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. And well, he's kind of an oddball in some ways, but I mean, he's obviously very intelligent, and he 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 fought the Russia hoax, back in during Trump's first term, and I actually dug up real information. It wasn't just that he slung some mud back at the opposition. He provided the information that became what was called the Nunes memo, and he pointed out some of the the obvious scheming that was taking place in the deep state, and it's it proved to be true. I mean, he did some good work back then, and so anyway, we do there are some bright spots in the incoming administration, individuals, but they're bright spots within a dark sky, because in general, I think we're getting more of the same, in some cases even worse than what we had before.
Right. Bright spots in relation to the Ukraine-Russian conflict, but it doesn't seem to be any bright spots in relation to the Palestinian crisis.
Right.
I heard some comments from Kash Patel. I think Tulsi Gabbard is also kind of turned into a Zionist
Yeah,
as well.
unfortunately, it's very sadly.
Right, but I heard Kash also say something about we need to, defend Israel, kind of an Israel first kind of person. So
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
that's just U.S. politics. Apparently, that's just how it
Right.
works. But do you believe that the U.S. empire is in irreversible decline right now?
Um. Yes. I mean, things could turn around, and we could adopt new policies. I think it the relative decline is inevitable. There's nothing that can be done by that, even if we adopt the wisest policies. What I mean by the relative decline is just the corresponding rise of other powers. And we're just talking about, pretty much the rest of the world. China, India, Russia, Iran, Brazil, and so on and so forth. All these countries are going to grow. There's nothing that the U.S. can do to stop it. I think rather very stupidly, and in the end, very much to its own harm, the United States is trying to stop the rise of China and Russia, in particular. Certainly Iran as well, and they can't do it, and they've just made, they've. We've seen the results. They've drawn together. They've created alliances or quasi alliances among themselves, and there's nothing we can do to impede their rise. We could just we could allow them to rise and maintain friendly relations with them, and their rise could be to their benefit. But we've, of course, have chosen a very different kind of policy, and we've turned them into enemies. And so their rise does not need to threaten us, but we have chosen to make them a threat to us. Yeah. So, again, it's just that this relative decline is irreversible. It's because because other countries were going to rise no matter what. But that was not a problem. I mean, that was something that we could have accepted, and it actually we could have allowed their rise to contribute to our general prosperity and well-being. Now, because of the policies that we're adopting, it's not just a relative decline, but I think we are entering into an absolute decline. The weaponization of the dollar, for example, has put the dollar, which has really been one of the, a tremendous blessing to the United States, having the world's reserve currency. We've put that status at risk by our weaponization of it. Again, is using it as a weapon against perceived enemies. And so potentially, we're putting our own economy at risk. We've gone greatly into debt. And the only reason I think that we haven't suffered the consequences of that yet is because of the fact that the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and so other countries just tend to they buy our debt. They're paying for kind of shouldering the burden of our excesses, of our fiscal recklessness. But I think inevitably that's not going to last, and we're going to hasten the demise of the dollar through our policies. That's just one example. Again, it doesn't have to be an absolute decline. Theoretically, we could continue to prosper. We could actually, become an increasingly prosperous nation, and a nation respected by the rest of the world. But we've chosen another path, and increasingly we're hated by the world and feared by the world, and yeah.
Do you see us getting off that path and taking on a better path? Because the decline of the American empire doesn't necessarily have to equate to the decline of America. It could be a chance for an American renaissance.
Exactly.
So do you think that's possible? I'd like to.
Yeah, well, theoretically, it is possible. That's I guess that's the point that I was trying to make. Theoretically, it is possible. We can accept the rise of other powers, and then we can, again, just kind of retire from our position as world hegemon in a graceful, a gracious way, and actually do quite well for ourselves. Again, there's no reason why that has to have any kind of negative consequences. In fact, it should have positive consequences. For example, we could put down the burden of these 800 or so military bases around the world. That's expensive. That's an expense that we don't need to have. And that's just one example. This world empire is costing us, and we could, that's something that we could simply, again, we can shed those responsibilities and prosper. Unfortunately, I just don't see any hope, any sign of renewal. I pointed out there's certain bright spots within the upcoming administration, but I don't see any reversal of the trend. Though of course, Trump uses his slogan, "Make America Great Again, America First." He continues to insist on America being the world's hegemon. So again, we had that threat, for example, when directed at the BRICS countries. He was going to slap 100% tariffs on all of them if they so much thought about, creating their own currency. And it's just the same kind of thinking. I think, unfortunately, it's the same kind of thinking. There really isn't, as far as foreign policy, as far as our relationship with the rest of the world, there's no reason to think that things are going to change in the upcoming administration or any foreseeable administration.
Right. So you don't see any hope of basically accepting a multipolar world of
no, I don't see it at all.
There are no politicians, nothing in our government institutions that will really allow for the dropping of the U.S. hegemony.
No, I do not see it. I don't see anybody who's even close to, a leadership position who is talking like that. Again, you can find somebody that is reasonable on Russia, but still, it's because it's part of the larger strategy. Now we have to go after China or something.
Exactly.
Again, it's still they still believe that America is the world's hegemon. They just have a slightly different approach to that. That's all there is. You have to go way, way down to somebody like Thomas Massie or whatever, who isn't anywhere close to the levers of power to find an American politician that is actually talking in a truly different way.
Well, if there is, you don't see anybody willing to accept the new world, the new reality. What does that mean for America? Well, where are we headed then if you don't see, you said we're headed for an absolute decline, because theoretically we could accept the decline of the empire and embrace, the new world order, which is a multipolar world, and we can have an American renaissance where we start to prosper from the prosperity of other countries instead of continually trying to control them and manipulate them, subjugate them. So what does that mean for us in the world?
Right.
Does that mean we're headed for an ultimate showdown? Because that's kind of what it feels like. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first I discussed briefly some of the possible economic consequences. Again, in particular, the consequences of weaponizing the U.S. dollar. But of course, the more that we become involved in these conflicts, the more confrontational we are, the greater the risk that we will actually be drawn into a direct conflict. Maybe, so far we've avoided that. We've come up, we're getting awfully close, for example, in Ukraine. Potentially, it's close that we could be in a direct conflict with, become involved in a direct conflict with Iran. We did participate in the most recent Israeli attack on Iran, right? So one or another of these conflicts could draw us in directly. We're just right there, towing the line, standing at the edge of the abyss, and of course, the consequences of a direct conflict with Russia could be catastrophic. We all know what that might mean. It's not inevitable that it would go nuclear, but it certainly could. And then in the case of Iran, we've talked about how, I don't think it wouldn't be nuclear between the U.S. and Iran, but it could be catastrophic for military or U.S. military bases and ships in the region. It could lead to a humiliation for the U.S. And again, that theoretically that could be a slap in the face, and we sober up and we begin to reassess. But based on what we've seen, that's not what happens. It'll probably lead to some sort of jingoistic reaction in the U.S. and more trouble. So, that's what I see. Unfortunately, the policies that we're pursuing are very reckless, and they could lead to direct conflict at some point in the not so distant future.
Do you think an economic collapse or a financial collapse is in the near future for the United States if the U.S. dollar no longer becomes a world reserve currency as it continues to sanction. I believe I just heard that we're giving another $50 billion to Ukraine, but we're taking them from Russia's frozen assets. I mean, this is just another example of
Right.
why countries like China are like, well, we can't be using the dollar anymore.
Right.
You know, well, what are we doing holding all these treasury bonds if the U.S. can just freeze them whenever they want? So it seems like that decline is irreversible. That weaponization of the dollar has is the final nail in the coffin for the dollars in a sense. It just takes a little while to lower the coffin all the way down.
Okay.
It's great.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
So if are we seeing potentially, is there a possibility for something like hyperinflation? And what does it mean if countries start to abandon the dollar at large? Does that mean that all of a sudden could we see something like what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany, where people are taking wheelbarrows of cash to the store? I mean, well, what would happen in the United States? Would that also just cause the empire to implode, right?
Well, it certainly could. I mean, I never want to make predict when something like this is going to happen. It's very, very hard to do. But I think it inevitably will happen. Is it going to be months? Is it going to be years? Is it going to go on past another decade? I don't know. And I don't think anybody does. But if you just look at the course that we're on, it's unsustainable. And the only reason that we've been able to sustain, this huge debt so far, and, we're just it's already, what is the debt now? It's like
36 trillion.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, because you're right. It's like every 4 or 5 months ago we throw, or that go by and we throw another trillion onto the pile there. I mean, it's just so big that it's hard to even conceive of. And, according to general rules of thumb, it's at this point where we should see the beginnings of a crisis. Now, I think the reason we haven't seen a crisis so far, again, is the fact that the U.S. is the world's reserve currency. So we get an extra cushion for that. But, that's, for the reasons that we've talked about, I don't think that's going to last forever. I mean, I don't think you could ever see nothing's going to last forever. Eventually, the U.S. dollar will cease to be the world's reserve currency. And one of the reasons that it may cease to be the world's reserve currency is this reckless spending. I mean, it's not just the weaponization of the dollar, but the really, let's say, improvident policies or behavior of the U.S. It's going to make a lot of countries, would-be investors think twice about investing in the dollar. You say that, they're printing dollars like crazy. Does it really make sense for me to buy dollars? It looks like the value of the dollar is very questionable. I mean, it's just that it's so. At some point, we have this huge debt, and we were able to get away from it for a long time because interest rates were so low. But then we had a problem with inflation, so we had to raise interest rates. And now we're getting this pressure to actually reduce interest rates again. But, which is...
Will lead to more inflation.
Yeah, we're going to lead to more inflation. We're in a, potentially in a vicious cycle. And it's just like, kind of like we're circling the drain right here. It's just like at some point, these forces just become impossible to delay or to mitigate in any significant sense. And I think we'll start going, we'll head down the drain. Again, I'm not going to give you a date, but I think it's inevitable. You're just looking at these forces, this combination of debt and in general, so and the weaponization of the dollar I think are just pushing us right towards the edge, and eventually we're going to go over.
I mean, it's a scary thing. I mean, when we see our currency collapse, I don't know if we would see hyperinflation. Obviously, everybody's going to take a hit. There's going to be a bit of chaos. But I'm wondering if it's a way that we would potentially avoid all-out conflict. It's a way that the empire can kind of would just collapse, and there'd be a chance to rebuild and be a new system on sound money and with cooperation, equal cooperation with other countries around the world. That's a possibility. The other, I'm trying to find bright spots, Dad. I don't want our podcast to be all
well, there's
doom and
potentially
gloom.
a civil right. You know, I think that's right. I mean, that's a kind of, again, a foreign policy disaster. Just kind of looking at past incidents such as 9/11, instead of being a wake up call, you know, a chance to re-examine our foreign policy, we just doubled down on our foreign policy, and you know, with the predictable results. But an economic disaster could be a real wake-up call. Well, first of all, it could force us to end the empire. You know, they close down those bases. They just say we just can't do it anymore, or to pursue these expensive confrontational policy, the proxy war in Ukraine, and so on. So it could have all those benefits, and it may cause us to look inward and finally to re-examine. You know, I would hope so. I think there is a chance of it. So that is a potential, you know, silver lining to the dark cloud of an economic collapse.
And maybe another potential way to have the decline of the empire, which is not a bad thing. You know, it doesn't mean that America disappears. It means a chance for America to be a normal country again.
Right. Also, to be the America that was envisioned by our founders. You know, remember, it was founded as a republic, and they understood the need to keep out of, you know, the conflicts of other countries. You know, that was George Washington and you know, John Adams. They understood that very clearly. That was a vision that they had for this country, and you know, unfortunately, we've strayed very, very far from that vision. But we could return to it. It's something within our own tradition. Right. It's not really a foreign idea. It's just, it would be a matter of returning to our roots.
Right. Okay. Do you see another path to get to returning to our roots without leading to an all-out conflict?
Well, okay. Yeah, that's, no, not really. I'm afraid I really can't think of anything. There, of course, you know, the history is full of surprises. So they're always, who knows what events could take place, and there are things that we're not even thinking about, that we don't see on the horizon, that could then suddenly appear and have an impact that we can't imagine.
Well, what about this? I mean, we talk about the U.S. empire, but the U.S. empire's influence is starting to crack and wane. We're seeing this. I mean, we've seen, if we take a look at what's been happening just sort of in the broader context of the U.S. empire, what happened in South Korea, for example, was a sign of the president, this neocon, essentially, you know, an American puppet or, you know, very strong ally of the United States, tried to have a coup, and the people said no, and the people don't want this. And we have our largest military base in South Korea, and it seems like a lot of our ideas, if we pivot towards China, we would use countries like Japan and South Korea as our bases to help with this conflict potentially with China. I don't think these countries want to be part of it, and kind of what we're seeing with the South Korean people, how they were very upset with the president and he had such low approval rating, shows a bit of a rejection of the American empire. This is the American empire candidate, and the South Korean people say no. We're saying the same thing in Europe. We have the French government's collapse. So, you know, Starmer is incredibly unpopular. You know, Schultz is unpopular. We see the rise of the AfD. We see, you know, in Romania, we see a candidate that is anti-NATO, U.S. empire. We are seeing these countries start to...
Yeah, though he was shot down by the Supreme Court. I mean, the election was actually canceled, or the results were canceled, and the Supreme Court ordered that the election be held again. And it was clearly, they didn't even provide any reason. It was clearly just because the wrong candidate had won. But that's another example of kind of the authoritarian reactions that we're seeing from the, you know, the so-called democratic forces.
Well, if they hold elections again, and then what are they going to do? They're going to pressure people or threaten people not to vote for this guy? See. I mean, like...
maybe, you know, it seems rather foolish, you know, most likely. Who knows, he'll probably do better this time.
But, exactly. What if he does better?
Yeah.
You can't hide it.
That's a good point. Right.
So perhaps that's another way for the empire to collapse is if the
Right.
vassals of the United States start to turn against,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, yeah, we talked
the
about
leader.
that. There are some hopeful signs within Europe. Like in South Korea, I think it's too much to say that it's like there's a party that's actually opposed to the alliance with the U.S. I don't think there's any serious political party within South Korea that wants to actually move away from the U.S. But I think the enthusiasm for the American empire that the current president showed was very unpopular. He took things too far, especially um, his desire to support Ukraine. I've heard that it was something like 80% of South Koreans were opposed to that. It was deeply unpopular. Um, yeah.
Does Ukraine have any friends in the world? I mean, I'm not talking about the governments. Obviously, we know what governments are supporting it because the United States is using
Yeah.
Ukraine and they say you have to support it. But are there any countries where the majority of the people are supporting Ukraine? Because it just seems like to me, no. Everybody is like, we don't want this. This has gone on
Yeah.
too far. Everybody
Well,
knows that Ukraine has lost, and they don't want to make this conflict larger than it needs to be.
yeah.
They want it
Well,
to end.
I unfortunately I would say that the majority of U.S. citizens actually still are in favor of providing military support to Ukraine. The results of a poll came out. I saw it this morning, and I think it's something like 55% of Americans, or maybe 52% or something. It's a majority. It's down somewhat from where it was a year ago, but there's still a majority. Now, I think if you actually put a price tag on it and said, "Oh, okay, so you want to send another 50 billion," I think probably you wouldn't get that big a numbers. People, say these things without really thinking through, and you ask them to pay for it, then they're not so interested. But I think you'll find, I think it's true too in Germany, that there are majorities. Now they're shrinking majorities, in favor of supporting Ukraine, and I think they're rather let's call them shallow majorities, meaning that this is not real ironclad support. People, answer yes, but it's not something that they're really enthusiastic about. And I think they could be easily dissuaded from. And meanwhile, in all these countries, in Germany, there's a growing opposition, which I think is a very strong opposition. It may be only 30%, but it's a strong 30% against a weak 55% or something like that. And I think that's what you're finding. They still, because there are a lot of, again, it's just most people in these countries, whether we're talking about the US or we're talking about Europe, they, they basically trust the authorities and they basically trust the mainstream. Well, maybe they don't, but I was going to say the mainstream media. There's a great deal of skepticism. Yet they say they don't trust them, but in fact, their views still are to a great extent shaped by the mainstream media. I think they understand, they have a feeling that they're being lied to. So, like in the US, we found that skepticism of the mainstream media is at an all-time high. And yet their views still are to a great extent shaped by the mainstream media. It's just that it's, like I would say, it's a rather shallow kind of support that you find in Ukraine, and it's fading. It's much weaker than it was, during 2022. I think if you graphed it, you would see the line is going down, and it will continue to go down. Um, yeah, again, it's not like Israel where you find very, um, fervent support, among the people. Um, Certainly in the United States, you don't find that kind of support in the U.S. or I think in most European countries. An exception. We may have to make an exception for the Baltic states and perhaps Poland as well. Um, but in general, it's just not there. They may get a majority in the polls, but they're not excited about it. And I think again, when you actually put a price tag on it, that most people say, they want to express some kind of support for Ukraine, but they're not interested in paying for it. It's the leaders who are enthusiastic about this, and the leaders who continue to make the policy, without any real support of the population.
Well, those leaders seem to become increasingly more unpopular.
Yeah,
They keep this stance because they seem to be putting, funding for Ukraine above the welfare of their own
right,
citizens.
right. Yeah, and in places like Germany, it's quite extraordinary. You have the leaders openly saying that and actually taking votes because Germany is, a fiscally conservative country. They try to balance the budget. They try to keep the debt under control. So, they realize they can't pay for everything. Unlike the U.S. that has the world's reserve currency, they can't just print more money. So they've actually had votes, where choices that, either we're going to support, let's say, this welfare program for German citizens, or we're going to send this money to Ukraine. And they've sent the money to Ukraine. And, the opposition parties have pointed this out, and people are not happy about it. Yeah.
But why can't the Western European countries and the United States, why can't they just engage in diplomacy, negotiate with Russia? It should become increasingly more apparent that they can't win this
Yeah.
unless they just want to go nuclear and potentially destroy the world. So what is it that is just keeping them going? What are they hoping to achieve? There's talks of a frozen conflict or whatever, but they don't ever ask the Russians,
Yeah,
who are
right,
clearly
right.
the
We're
ones that
talking
are going to that are in
Yeah.
charge, that
Yeah.
are commanding the situation now. That they will be able to dictate the terms much more than we can. So I just what's the end goal? Do they really think that they can just draw this out for years with just no regard to the Ukrainian people, let them all die? I mean, like, this is what is the plan? I mean, you said there is no plan, but I
Yeah,
mean, the plan
right.
is just
Yeah.
to kick the can down the
Right.
road.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I'll just repeat what I said before. They had their plan A that failed miserably, and they just don't have a plan B. So they just keep on repeating plan A. I mean, that's absurd, of course, but that's what you find. And why can't they go to plan B? Because plan B, I think, would just involve, let's say, yeah, why don't we talk to the Russians? But once we talk to the Russians, then we admit, first of all, that the Russians are not the devil. They've demonized the Russians, and particularly Putin, to such a great extent. You say, well, you can't talk to the devil. You can't make a deal with the devil. All you can do is fight him. And then on one hand, they call the Russians, evil, but on the other, they also pretend that they're weak and they're on the verge of collapse. And you're still getting that kind of language. Recently there was some fluctuation in the currency markets, and the ruble weakened for a while. Now it's just back to where it was before. But immediately there were headlines, throughout the West. Yeah, the ruble is about to turn to rebel. The Russian economy is about to collapse. The Russians themselves, were not hardly even noticed it, and and it just wasn't a big deal. The Russian economy is not about to collapse, but they've been talking this way the whole time, because that's the other part of it, is that Russia is evil, but it's also weak. And so there's no point in talking to him. First, you shouldn't. It's immoral to talk, to the devil, and then it's also, there's no need to, because the devil is so incredibly weak, and we just need to impose, new conditions on him. And both of these notions are absurd, but they're just held as like articles of religious faith by these people. And why is that? Because all these people are believers in the religion of Western hegemony and supremacism. I mean, they really, really, really believe in it deeply, and that's just something that they can't abandon. And if they start talking to Russia, it's sort of a way of, that would be admitting, okay, that we're wrong, that we aren't the hegemon. Okay, we aren't. Okay, that there are other countries with their own interests and their own ways of life that are legitimate. We can't admit any of that. That just goes counter to the religion of our leaders.
Well, okay, so if we don't refuse to communicate, although I hope it changes under Trump, but let's say if we do start to engage in diplomacy and agree to neutrality for Ukraine, then that doesn't necessarily mean the end of NATO, or it's not a damaging thing to Europe at all. I mean, that's actually good, right? That's a great thing, right? If Ukraine just gets no NATO neutrality,
Right.
we
Right.
stop the
I think
aggression.
objectively it would be a wonderful thing for everybody concerned. And, we could have avoided this war altogether. It would have been great above all, for Ukraine. Yeah, it's just a disaster. Ukraine, it's kind of interesting because Zelensky actually at certain times in his career showed an awareness of this. His thinking has changed over the years. Again, he was elected as a peace candidate. He was going to implement the Minsk Accords, which Russia also wanted to implement. But when he took power, I think it's just like he was basically taken into the back room and explained to him that that's not how we do things around here. And there was actual real threats to his life when he attempted to push make a push for peace with Russia, and he for a short while he did try, or made some sort of gestures in support of the Minsk Accords, but that didn't last. He abandoned it, and then at the beginning of the SMO, way back in March of 2022, he said, what we would now call a Russian talking point. He said that it was clear to him that the Western powers wanted to use Ukraine against Russia, to weaken Russia, even if that meant sacrificing Ukraine. This was something that he was aware of at the time. So at that point, remember, he was still talking to the Russians. He was trying to negotiate with them. But then he was convinced by Boris Johnson and others, to tear up the agreement, the Istanbul Agreement, and just to go on. And I think at that point, there was some point where he became a Banderite and a globalist, and since then we haven't seen any signs of awareness. It's just like I think he basically sold his soul to the real devil, and there's just no coming back.
Right. I feel like this Ukraine war, we should really view it now as it's a war between America or U.S. hegemony against Russia now. Do you think that that's the right way to be looking at it now, framing it? And it really kind of the whole time it's been that.
Yeah, well, it would have, okay. Clearly in all these cases, there are local players with local interests. And the Banderites, they have their own version of Ukrainian nationalism, which is largely about hating Russia, erasing Russian identity, elevating Ukrainian identity and language. We know all the things to do. That's just absolutely no exaggeration. It's just that before the SMO and since then, they've just taken measure after measure to suppress Russian identity. And that's specifically Banderite. But, they are working, hand in glove with the globalists. So they have made themselves vassals of the globalists. And when we're talking about the globalists, it's the U.S.-led, rules-based order, right? So though they have their own local, roots and ideology, they have integrated themselves so that they're just, the two have become one within Ukraine. So you could say that that's basically what it has become. It is, it's basically, Western hegemony against the U.S., with a certain Ukrainian local flavor.
Well, you mean Western hegemony against
Russia? Okay,
Russia,
yeah,
against
okay.
something against
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
one step.
So right. So if that's what we're looking at, that's kind of how I view it. Does that mean that this ends with the collapse of the American empire, the end of NATO, or it seems like Russia? It won't be okay with the frozen conflict. We're not going to get a North Korea, South Korea thing. It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, and Russia's clearly the driver's seat, and it sounds like that. That Western Europe has committed itself not to engaging in a diplomatic solution, so that this inevitably will keep on going until the NATO collapses or the Western-led world collapses. Or is there a possibility that the U.S., as we're out, and then throws it all on Europe, and Europe just collapses and begins to turn on the United States or something. I mean, it just, I'm just trying to figure out how this plays out. Like, we could let Ukraine be neutral and everything be okay, and we can work together and start cooperating. But if that's off the table, then is the only thing that, are we looking at the final outcome of U.S. hegemonic collapse?
Well, I don't think that will necessarily be the outcome. It would, it's going to end on the battlefield, because I don't think there any negotiations are possible. And Russia will go to the point where they're satisfied, that they have achieved their objectives. And I think that will mean, it'll be all of eastern and southern Ukraine, including Odessa, because I don't think they can. I think they understand that Black Sea coast has to be under their control. Otherwise, NATO will establish a base there, and they can't let that happen. So I think it'll go at least that far. I don't know if they're going to attempt to go on to Kiev or anything like that, but it'll at least be southern and eastern Ukraine, and then they may stop. Now that will be clearly a defeat for NATO. They'll try to spin it the best that they can, but I think everybody will see it as a defeat for NATO. That doesn't mean that the U.S. will collapse, Western hegemony will collapse, or that NATO will collapse. I mean, it could even be used as an excuse for beefing up NATO. Say, look, this is really scary. We lost. We can't let this happen. Who knows? It will obviously create all kinds of strains, but it's hard to predict how NATO will behave, because, again, I think they've been so irrational. They've been so who knows what kind of response we'll see from NATO. The U.S., it's easier for the U.S. to walk away from it. I clearly it will be perceived as a defeat for them by most of the world. But we have very powerful propaganda organs here that will spin things to the point where a lot of people think that somehow, they're thinking now that somehow we did actually succeed. That they'll say, for example, I'm sure that the Russians plan to take all of Ukraine. And look, it took them 4 or 5 years to just take part of Ukraine. And in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of their soldiers died, and they've suffered grievous losses, and they've really learned their lesson. This was a great success for us. Now, I think a lot of people will see through that, but again, there are a lot of people who just don't think very clearly. In the U.S. too, where we're not really suffering the direct consequences of these disastrous policies, it may not have such a huge impact here. Again, I think it's like Israel is the country that's joined at the hip with the U.S. And if Israel is defeated, that's going to have huge consequences. Again, it's not to say there would be no consequences, but I think the U.S. potentially could minimize it. Again, we're economically insulated from what's going on there. We never had the connections, the economic connections to Russia that Europe did. Europe is a different story. I think it's going to be a real disaster. It's already being a kind of a disaster for Europe. And we'll see. Maybe it'll lead to the rise of truly dissident parties that will reorient Europe, away from Western hegemony and towards a multipolar world. I have some hope for that. I'm not going to... I wouldn't bet on it, but I have some hope for that. At least a part of Europe will do that.
We haven't seen the use of any attack storm shadows or scalps in probably about a week now, right?
I think 11 days,
11 days. Okay, so more than a week. Why do you think that is?
Well, maybe the message did get through, the combination of the Oreshnik strike and the destruction of the launchers in the Sumy region. It may also be, again, the destruction of those launchers may have deprived them of the means to carry out an attack. Maybe that was a big part of their arsenal there, and it's gone. And, they may plan on doing it again in the future, but they got to get these new launchers in position. That's a possibility. But it may be that the message did get through. I mean, again, the combination of the two convinced people who were already doubtful about this escalation to oppose it more firmly, and gave them some more ammunition within these eternal battles in places like the Pentagon and so forth. And so perhaps that it has been put on hold. We'll see. Only time will tell.
Yeah, if it has been put on hold, you think and the message got through, you just think that then people will be like, okay, now's the time to come to the table. But we just won't do it. I just don't get it. I just don't understand. Just please, somebody go. Why is it only Tucker Carlson that can talk to anybody in Russia?
they can't do that. They just can't do that.
Yeah, and then, I mean, maybe we'll see. Maybe we'll see with one thing that was said in the Tucker interview that was a little reassuring was that Tucker said that Trump has promised to end this conflict. He said it many times on the campaign trail. He brought that up. And I hope that puts some pressure on Trump, who might have, the ear, Tucker might have his ear a little bit, or just Tucker saying that, reminding the people that, like, hey, Trump, this is what you said you were going to do. Please do it and end this war. We don't want to fight Russia. This doesn't have to be this way. Yeah. Although the problem is something that also Tucker brought up in the interview was that he asked Sergei Lavrov if he thought it would be possible for Russia to come back in with the West to counter the rise of China. That's often the position that people have, that they might be good on ending this one conflict, but it's all about still maintaining U.S. hegemony because there's another rising threat, and it's the Asian threat.
Tucker Carlson included. He tends to be in that camp,
Right, so it's just everybody has that thinking that, take your pick. China, Iran, Russia, we got to fight one of them. There's nobody out there that says, like, hey, we don't have to fight anybody. Let's all get along. We can all trade, engage in commerce, respect each other's culture. It's just not there. So I'm afraid that maybe Trump comes in, he ends the Ukraine conflict, but then there's going to be a pivot towards China. And that would be even more disastrous than what would happen to Ukraine if something sparked in the Southeast China Sea or between Taiwan and China. Do you see that playing out that way? I mean, what type of consequences would there be for the United States if we try to contain China?
Yeah, well, we're already trying to contain China. It's just a question if we become, even more aggressive. I mean, there is the potential. There have already been some close calls. I think it was several years ago that U.S. plane and a Chinese plane actually collided or in the sky. That may have been a long time ago, but anyway, it just kind of shows there's this constant game of chicken, both in the air and on the sea, and something could go wrong at some point. And then there's always Taiwan, and you have a government there that is just keeps on pushing closer and closer to actually outright declaring independence. They've done like everything but, and China has made it clear that they will not tolerate that it's the reddest of red lines. If Taiwan declares independence, then of course China will take Taiwan by military force. So again, there are tensions, and the U.S. is right in the middle of it, which actually really increases the tensions because, if anybody knows anything about Chinese history, there's this real anger that has never left the Chinese about the abuses that they suffered at the hands of the imperial powers, and they see the U.S. as the remaining imperial power directly intervening in their affairs. And when we have people in Taiwan and they send weapons to Taiwan, Taiwan to China, and we too, the U.S. has admitted this, is part of China, so they see us intervening. And the more we get involved, I think the greater the anger becomes within China. And I think there's at least a faction with China that would just love to humiliate the U.S. I mean, and if they, at some point where they see that, already, there used to be a time when that just, we could do what we wanted there. We could always steam ships through the Taiwan Strait and never have to worry about it because we were so much more powerful than China. but those days have already ended, and I think most American military analysts agree that if a war broke out there, China would win it. Now, at some point, it just becomes easy for them to win it. I think they maybe just not. They're not going to worry about it. They're careful. They don't. Well, China doesn't want a war. But as the balance of power keeps on shifting in their favor, at some point, it's just like they're going to be less fearful of a war. We'll just put it that way. I don't know exactly when they're going to reach that point, but I think that's what we're looking at.
The goal of my conversation with you today, I was thinking before the podcast, was try to find some bright spots, talk about how the U.S. can come out of this better and stronger, how this could be a good thing for America, that we can't have a American Renaissance, that we can avoid all-out war and conflict.
Right.
But you've been popping my bubbles here. I don't
yeah,
see...
well, the only thing is, again, it's just that I think I pointed out that actually it is America's roots, are in America as a republic, America as the shining city on the hill, that we lead by example. That's something that's there, and people like Thomas Massey and whatever still embody that. It's not entirely dead, and it could be brought back, but again, I think only if there's some sort of domestic crisis, an economic crisis, and then perhaps, the status quo will fall and we'll have something new. Right. So that's the only potential bright spot that I see.
Right. I think America needs to rediscover its identity. But it's difficult because it's been so long. This imperial hubris has...
Right. Have forgotten what America once was, right?
Right. So hopefully we can rediscover that, but it sounds like it's not going to happen until there's some real calamities, either economic crisis or crises, I should say, and or foreign policy, foreign conflict crises. Okay, well, maybe we can end just a little bit with covering the Middle East just a bit. So I saw that in Syria, the city of Hama fell, and it's when we talk about Syria, it just seems like we always talk about all these groups. We got Russia there, we got the U.S. there, Iran is involved, Israel's involved, Hezbollah's involved. We got Uyghurs from Xinjiang, we got Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turks, everybody. But one people that seems like we don't talk a lot is the Syrians themselves, the Syrian army, and I just realized that I find it odd that Syria doesn't seem to be fighting for itself. It's become a playground for all of these other powers and all these other countries. Where are the Syrians themselves in this conflict? Do they have an identity crisis themselves?
That's a good question, right? And a lot of people are asking, where are the Syrians? Now, it must be remembered that in the war that went on from, I think, roughly 2011 to 2019, the civil war, Syria certainly got help from Russia and from Hezbollah, from Iran. But, by and large, the war was fought by the Syrian Arab army. And they fought very bravely. They fought against, it was these long and very difficult battles, but they took back their country. At one point, there was very little left of Syria that was under the actual Syrian government. We're talking about like 10% of the country. That's what they came back from. And they fought back and they just clawed back. They did have help, but they did it. By and large, they were the ones who did it. Maybe they couldn't have done it on their own because they were just they had these very powerful forces arrayed against them. But they ended up taking back most of their country. Now this time, so people really are shocked by the sudden collapse of the Syrian army. I was shocked by it too. And what's happened? Well, people have pointed to different things. And, one is these very cruel economic sanctions that the U.S. and the West have imposed on Syria. It was already a poor country. And then the occupation of the oil fields and the wheat fields in eastern Syria by the U.S. It's deprived them, of one of their main sources of income. So here's a poor country that just became desperately poor. And it was just hard for them to maintain an army, to pay salaries. And it looks like perhaps some of their commanders were corrupted, were paid off even, by by these jihadists. That may have been part of what happened. So it's just a kind of a hollowing out of the country, and in particular the army. Um, that we'll see. I mean, I think it was also, some, you could say, some serious, um, obviously mistakes were made. They weren't prepared. They hadn't built up the fortifications. They weren't taking the jihadists seriously enough. They didn't have their best forces there. They didn't have sufficient forces there. And now, apparently they're trying to bring the forces in, but it takes some time. And of course they're getting aid from other groups as well, Hezbollah, Russia, so on and so forth. So hopefully they can turn out that we can see the old Syrian army, and with the help of their friends, they can turn the tide. It's, right now it's really depressing. I frankly, I find it even hard to read the news because I find it heartbreaking. I just know what Syria's been through. How they've suffered all these years, and there was some hope, and now it's like the old nightmare is back again, and it's just so awful.
Right. Yeah, I would expect there to be kind of a rallying around the flag effect if your country is under attack by truly vicious people,
right?
Terrorists. I saw some videos last night that kept me up of, throat slitting, beheadings, just
those are the kind of people that they're fighting, right?
Yeah, just really awful things. And it's like, if there's any reason to stand up and fight, it's just if these type of people are coming into your towns and cities and killing people like this,
right?
It's time to stand up. But it seems like there's almost an apathy within the Syrian army. I mean, I don't know it. I shouldn't judge it. I'm not.
Right.
I'm just. I see it very.
We'll see.
Superficially,
right. Again, it's just it could be poor leadership. It could have been lack of preparation, and again, the sleeper cells within these cities. They were just taken by surprise and disorganized. They were being attacked from the front and the back at the same time. And hopefully they can bring it together, and like they did in the early years of the first civil war.
Right. I think it reflects quite poorly though on Bashar al-Assad. He has a duty to sort of create this sense of identity and nationalism and pride, and it's his duty to protect the people. And it seems like he hasn't done a good job during this time. Obviously,
clearly
it's a
mistakes
difficult.
Right. Clearly he made some mistakes, but he was also up against again, the odds were stacked against him. I mean, his country was already poor, and it just became poorer. He just had fewer and fewer resources to work with, and his allies were distracted with other things. The Russians had only a kind of a skeletal presence. They had removed most of their forces. They have, they're returning them now. Clearly he made mistakes, but it was also just an extremely difficult situation that, even if he hadn't made any mistakes, I think he would be up against, a terrible threat right now.
Mm. Okay, well, I'm going to finish with a headline from the Telegraph that I'm sure you will enjoy. The Telegraph ran this headline, said, "How Syria's diversity-friendly jihadists plan on building a state." And in that, they quote from the leader of this terrorist army, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, saying, "Diversity is a strength, and it is unfair for us to be called terrorists." So what's your take on that?
Oh, well, that changes everything. I'm sorry. I didn't know that. It just kind of makes me think a little bit of like what's happening in Ukraine. Again, we have neo-Nazis, or I think more properly call them Banderites, these ultra-nationalists or just vicious Russian haters, and want to erase, Russian identity and just kill Russians whenever they can. They don't care if they're civilians or soldiers. But what they had, the Ukrainian army had a transgender spokesperson, and they indulge in some of these things, and it just seems to be it works. I mean, it's just all that the West needs, because they're not interested in the truth. They just want to, you just give them a fig leaf, and that's all they need. They'll support, head chopping jihadists, and they'll support, again, the Banderites in Ukraine. If it's just they hardly need an excuse. You give them a little excuse, and that they're off to the races. They'll give you everything you want.
Yeah, it's so absurd,
yeah.
that they run this type of a headline, and then you see, like I said, these videos of just horrific, shooting people point blank that are bandaged, handcuffed, and slitting people's throats, and then they say, oh well, this is a diversity friendly jihadist. Like, I just don't understand. The world's going crazy, Dad, or the West is going crazy, and you've given me very little to be hopeful for. So, okay.
I'm sorry. My apologies.
That's all right. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say before
I think that's
end
it. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add.
Okay. All right, then let's end it there. Okay.
Okay.
Have a good weekend, Dad.
Okay, you too.
Okay. All right, bye-bye.